This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's oral history program, Living Legends Collection. This interview was originally done on the 16th of March, 1972. The interview was conducted by Mr. Pendleton Woods. The interviewee is Mr. Frank S. Midgley, and that's capital Midgley Jr. of Ponca City, Oklahoma. This material is being re-recorded on January the 17th, 1989 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is March 16th, 1972. We're in Ponca City, Oklahoma at the First Presbyterian Church where we're making interviews, and I'm visiting today with Mr. Frank S. Midgley, and that's Midgley Jr. of Newkirk, Oklahoma. Mr. Midgley is the president and chairman of the board of the Eastman National Bank in Newkirk, and he is son of a pioneer family in Newkirk, and we will be talking mainly about Newkirk itself and about the history of Newkirk and background as he knows as a member of a pioneer family. Mr. Midgley, I wanted to begin with if you would tell us who your parents were, where they came from, and when they came into the area.
Okay, thank you. My father was Frank S. Midgley, who was born in 1885 in Minneapolis, Kansas, which is a little town north of Salina. My mother was Jessie McMillan Midgley, was born in 1891 in Aurora, Illinois, and is still living. My people came to Newkirk very early in its beginning. My grandfather, George Midgley, ran in the opening of the strip in September of 1893 and rode his horse from the state line in Kansas to Newkirk, which was one of the few pre-platted communities. For instance, Ponca City was not platted, it just happened. But Newkirk was platted out by the surveyors, and he ran in with his horse in the run and stopped on a certain business lot on the south side of the square as it was platted. And the story is that he put his foot over on the next lot in order to save it for a man named Eastman, E.B. Eastman, on which to put a bank. And the bank in Newkirk is still the Eastman National Bank. He located a grocery and dry goods store on the south side of the square in Newkirk, and later moved over onto the east side, where it turned out that that's where the business settled rather than on the south side. And there is a stone, they had a frame building at first, and there are some old pictures where the frame building was moved out in the middle of the street so they could build the stone building, which still exists with his name over the top, although my family hasn't owned the building for many years. My father came in the next day on the train with his mother. He was 8 years old, into Newkirk from the north, and went on through to Oklahoma City, where my grandfather and grandmother lived. My grandfather didn't stay in Newkirk after he staked this out. Apparently that was later, because he was in Oklahoma City associated with stockyards. My father went to school in Newkirk at what was known then as the Presbyterian Academy. We always joked that he was the valedictorian of his class, and I'm quite sure he was the only one in the class. We still have an edition on the west side of Newkirk called the Academy Edition, where that Presbyterian Academy existed. He went to college in Beloit, Wisconsin, Beloit College, where he met my mother, who was from Aurora, Illinois, and they were married in 1911. My mother well remembers coming down to Newkirk, I suppose as a potential bride to look over things, and in 1910, and things were still pretty primitive in Newkirk at that time. My grandfather had acquired by that time some grassland east of the river, which the family still owns, And she recalls going out there and to take a horseback ride and kind of getting lost from the other people and just pretty much lost as to where she was. And she just stopped and sat on a stump, and pretty quick Grandpa George came along and found her. She had the good judgment to just sit still and wait for somebody to come to her. Those are just little things that I've heard recounted through the years, and I guess it's the type of thing you want, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
I probably can talk better about a little background of the Eastman National Bank, which is the oldest bank in the Cherokee Strip. We've determined this in recent years, but as a matter of just literally writing to some other banks in the area, and we find that our claim to that distinction, such as it is undisputed. The bank was founded on October the 9th of 1893, about 3 weeks after the Cherokee Strip area was opened up by Mr. E.B. Eastman, and it was completely owned and managed by Eastmans, Mr. Eastman and 3 sons. It was first located on the south side of the square in Newkirk on the lot that George Midgley held for Mr. Eastman. When that turned out to be a unsatisfactory location, they moved it over to the west side of the square on the corner, and this was likewise not the right place, because the business, it seemed, when it settled down, all was on the east and north side of the square. So the third move for the Bank of Santa Fe, as it was called then, was at the corner of 7th and Main, where it still exists. The bank was nationalized from the Bank of Santa Fe to the Eastman National Bank in 1909, and the name continues to this day. There have been no Eastmans in the bank since about 1911 or 12. My father was in the bank in 1912 and 13, but was unsatisfied with the manner in which it was being run. He didn't have any ownership to speak of, and left the bank and went with his father in the cattle business. Then in 1918, he and a man named P.S. Mason and the Klein family, W.S. Klein, the elder, and William H. Klein, his son, and founded the Security State Bank in a location just across the street from the Eastman National Bank, which is now the home site of the Albright Title and Trust Company, which has a history all of its own. In 1927, the Security State Bank and the Eastman National Bank merged, which probably is what saved them from the bad bank years to come in the early 30s. There were as many as 5 banks at one time in Newkirk. In addition to the 2 banks I've mentioned, there was a First National Bank and a Farmers State Bank, and at one time a Guarantee State Bank, so that there were as many as 5 at one time. Now there's only 1. The First National Bank was owned and managed by a family named Smith. Mr. P.W. Smith was likewise one of the early people in the community, and was the Newkirk's first treasurer, and a very prominent family. His son, can't say his name, W.F. Smith, I think, later took over the bank, but they pretty much sold out to the Eastman National people in about 1936, and the Farmer State Bank followed suit. 2 principal family names in the Farmer State Bank: A.A. Slosson, S-L-O-S-S-O-N, was the president, and J.H. Coleman was the cashier, and both prominent families in town.
In the growth of Newkirk, what have been some of the major factors in the development of the town?
Well, it's an interesting note, Penn, that Newkirk really hasn't grown a whole lot.
What's it say?
Officially 2,300, 2,275, something like that. We always think there are more than that, but I think every town has that same feeling. And this basic population figure hasn't really varied much through the years. I think there were that many people there 50 years ago. Newkirk is the county seat, and this, of course, has prevented it perhaps from slipping downhill like many small towns that size. And we always think that the adjacency to communities like Ponca City, Blackwell, Arkansas City, almost on an equidistant basis, has helped us as we become the bedroom town for industries and things in those communities. Newkirk is primarily it's kind of the dividing line between the wheatlands to the west and the grasslands to the east. Of course, the Arkansas River is just 5 miles east of town, and that's really the real dividing line between what we think of as wheatland and cattle country. But Newkirk, while it has been very stable, has not experienced a great deal of growth.
Who are
during the
others
years.
who have played a role in Newkirk history?
Oh, there's many names. I've mentioned the Smiths and the Kleins, the Slausons, the Colemans, the Johnson family, who were then and are today the owners, at least control of the Albright Title and Trust Company, which is, I think, not quite as old as the bank, but awfully close, about 3 years younger or something. And they're a very fine old firm, and today they employ 50 people, and as such, other than for governmental, are the largest payroll in our community. And its background is all Johnson, and there's a Johnson running it today. Probably will be in generations to come, since he has 3 sons. I refer to William F. Johnson. One of the real old-timers in our community, his aunt Pearl Groshong just died 10 days ago, and she was one of the very early figures, and many history accounts of our town refer to the very lovely and gracious Pearl Johnson, as was her maiden name. Other names, there are so many.
What events would you say have stood out in the history of Newkirk? Either a single event or a culminating event, in other words, a situation.
Well, it's hard for me to put my finger on anything real momentous in that respect. I suppose every community's had its calamities long before my time. Well, I think about the early 1900s, very early 1900s, 1902 or something. They had a whole business block burned down, and these were old wooden early time buildings, and my father always told the story that I think there were 7 saloons in the block, and including some billiard parlors and that sort of thing, that the cue balls ran rather liberally in the streets, you know, after and during the fire, and that there were some more or less houses of ill repute in the second stories, and people were throwing everything out, and of course everything broke that they fell out, but it was, I guess, quite a momentous occasion in town. Dad always told the story about the particular saloon keeper there. The name was Thomas, and there were brothers. But he announced very definitely that if Prohibition came, that the grass would grow in the streets. And he was noted very visibly on the morning after when Prohibition became law, walking down the streets, which were dirt, sowing grass seed. He wasn't going to be made a liar, but my father used to love to tell that story. There was going to be grass growing in the streets.
That's a great story.
Well, I think it's true. I'm a little lost to think of any more offhand.
Did you have any other major fires or?
No, I think that's the only real disastrous type thing that's ever happened to Newkirk. We've never been hit by a tornado. We don't rely on it too much, but I've always been told that there's an old Indian legend that Newkirk, lying between, almost equidistant, not quite, in between the Chickasaw and the Arkansas, that would never be touched by a tornado. I don't think we rely too much on that, but the truth of the matter is, for as long as the 78 years that Newkirk's been there, why, we've never had a tornado.
Do you have any industry in Newkirk?
No industry as the word goes, no. We have quite a substantial trucking firm, glass wholesale and trucking firm, which employs a number of people. They're not industry in the sense of manufacture.
Have you had him in the past?
No. This reminds me, though, and I appreciate that help. I've always understood from my forefathers, my own father and other older men with whom I've been associated, that Mr. Marland originally would like to have put his refinery at Newkirk, and the powers to be at that time didn't want that nasty old smelly refinery there, and so maybe that's the reason we're 2,500 and Ponca City's 30,000. But it might have made a lot of difference. I don't know just how authentic that story is, but there was a little refinery out north of town, Pirtle Pittman, I believe, Pirtle Pittman. I think you can still read it on the side of an old brick building out there if you look carefully. Not in my time. I was born in 25, and but the old brick buildings are still there, and there was a refinery there at that time. But that's about the closest to any industry of any substance at all in Newkirk. Newkirk's primarily a farming community and provides labor for the refinery in Ponca City and the foundries and smelters in Blackwell and packing houses in Arkansas City.
Have you had any people from Newkirk who have played any major role in some area of Oklahoma history?
Oh, we've had, when you said Oklahoma history, we've had two people who've become very prominent with Santa Fe Railroad, and his name was Jiggs, and that isn't his real name, Jiggs Chapel, born and raised in our community. He has a sister living here in Ponca City yet, and he was chief passenger agent for Santa Fe Railroad before he retired a few years ago. I suppose this is a pretty exalted position. I know that we always turned to him if we needed something from the Santa Fe. Well, we could always call on Jiggs Chapel, and he could get it done for us. A few years ago, well, in '68, which was our Diamond Jubilee, we had quite a summertime celebration. Spent most of the summer at it. Those of us that were heavily involved in it will swear we'll never do it again, but as we look back on it, it was well worth the effort. One of the things we needed to do was to get the old Santa Fe train, the Cyrus K. Holiday, which they keep, one of the original old trains. They keep it out in California, and then they moved it because Jiggs Chapel asked them to. Why, they moved it all the way out here and had it on display for our Jubilee celebration. The celebration turned out to be one of the biggest things that Newkirk's ever done. I think it involved practically everybody in town, and putting on a big pageant with 300 people in it 4 nights in a row. It was one of those things where you hire a firm to help you with it and guide you along with it. It was the Rogers Company from somewhere up in Iowa, very capable people, and we didn't believe it could be done, and but we did have a tremendous success, and I think gained the respect of our fellow communities in the area, because in order to get that done, it's no small job.
Do you have any major annual events in Newkirk, or are you for your town? What do you consider the major annual event?
Oh my. In recent years, a group of young people have put together a real nice rodeo, which does seem to grow every year. They have it in late August or late July or early August every year, and it has done pretty well, but it's on a pretty small scale. The K County Junior Livestock Show and sale is always held in March. In fact, it's next week. Been going on for a number of years. No, I don't think there's anything real big on an annual basis in Newkirk.
Do you think of anything else in the development of Newkirk that we haven't mentioned that ought to be mentioned? Any events?
I suppose it might be pertinent to note that well, there are 5 communities. Well, 6 if you count Call City. There are considerably more communities in K County than there are in lots of Oklahoma counties, and 4 cities of the first class, so to speak. all of them are bigger than Newkirk. That is, the other three. And yet we're the county seat. And this has always been a little speculation about this. Newcomers to the area, well, how the devil's that little town gets to be the county seat? And long before my time, I think Ponca City would always have liked to have it, and probably would yet. But Ponca City and Blackwell have always competed pretty stiff for things, and in days gone by, why, they were more the same size than they are today. And Blackwell always sided in with Newkirk, just despite Ponca City. And it was for that reason the county seat ended up in Newkirk and remains there. Of course, we hope we can keep it there on the same basis. I don't know, the Ponca City people might not appreciate that comment, but I think it's basically so. Ask me something else.
In growing up in high school and going back in your own area, do any individuals stand out, say in education in your?
Yes, that's a good question. I appreciate that. Newkirk in the late 30s, early 40s, had a very outstanding, well, of course, he'd been there longer than that, but the outstanding part came about at that time in a orchestra director named O.H. Atterbury, who created from this little town a very prominent and successful high school orchestra. Attended orchestra contests over the country and won in its class, first place in Madison, Wisconsin in what year would that be, 36 or 7. I remember that I was not old enough to be in the orchestra, but I went along because my mother's people lived in Illinois, and we went along on the special train and got off in Joliet to visit her people in Aurora. But Mr. O.H. Atterbury made a very definite contribution to musical education and just good sound philosophy of living to Newkirk, and is one of our revered people. At the time he died, this would have to be 48 or 9 or something like that. He never had anything because he always gave things to the kids. If they needed a new reed or a new violin string, why, he took care of it. And I was in Newkirk at the time, and we more or less gave his ex-students all over the country through the newspaper an opportunity to contribute to a memorial fund. And the money flowed in generously from all over the country, and we erected a very fine stone, just a large stone, but specially made out the cemetery for him. And there is a real fine plaque, a marble plaque with a picture on it in the high school halls today. But there's fewer and fewer of us, but he's really revered and well thought of in the memories of Newkirk. Of course, the days of orchestras, it's all bands now, and we don't have orchestras much. But definitely Mr. Atterbury was a strong figure in the educational history in Newkirk.
You think of any other personalities in Newkirk who should be mentioned?
Oh, Newkirk's full of personalities. It's hard to pick one out that might be, or to remember to think of it at the time. I suppose we're like every other small town. Everybody says somebody ought to write a book about the characters in the town, and yet when you sit down and try to think who they are and put it down, it's difficult to think of them. No, I'm at a loss just to pick out anyone.
Can you think of anything else, any other reminiscences you feel? There's some very good ones we've got that we should.
Most of my knowledge is relative to the banking business, of course, and I think I've pretty much covered that. And of course, that same history is available. And we published a real fine book in 1968 at our Diamond Jubilee. The people who more or less put on the Rogers people who helped us with us objected strenuously to the nature of it, because they had meant for it to be a brochure that you hawk for 50 cents at the Pantomimes, and the people, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Boone and Mrs. Urey, people like that went at it in such a dedicated way that they created a slick paper book full of old pictures, and it's a very fine publication. They wouldn't let us print but 1,000 copies of it, and we did that, and some of us stood responsible for another 500, and they immediately sold out, and there's since been another printing. And I think the books, I know there's a copy of it in the State Historical Society because we saw to it that they had one, but it's a very fine publication. And much of what I've told you is in that. Maybe not all. I'm sure not about the grass growing in the streets.
Well, thank you very, very much. This has been an interview with Mr. Midgley, if I can give you correctly, Mr. Frank S. Midgley Jr., who is president and chairman of the board of the Eastman National Bank of Newkirk. Thank you very much.